Hello everybody, and welcome to part 3 of my Assassination Rogue PvE guide. This part will focus on your stats. So let's talk a little bit about what each of the stats do for Assassination Rogues. And the first one I want to talk about is Haste. And Haste is actually a really nice stat for us this expansion. It does a lot of things that Assassination Rogue needs, particularly on single target or on a small number of targets. The first thing it gives you is energy regeneration, so just the speed with which your energy bar fills up. That scales with Haste, so the more you have, the faster your energy bar fills up, the fewer globals in your rotation you're going to be spending just waiting for energy to come back, which is nice. Haste also increases the rate at which your dots tick, which obviously increases your damage, but it also increases your energy, again, because whenever your bleeds tick on a poison target, you get a little bit of energy back, right? So the more times that happens, the more frequently that happens, the fewer globals you're going to have to spend waiting. So Haste gives you a lot of effects in that vein. Haste also increases your auto attack speed, which melee attacks do a lot more damage than they did in previous expansions this expansion. So that's another reason why Haste is so good this expansion, when it was not as good in previous expansions. The next stat I want to talk about is Crit. Now Crit obviously gives your attacks a chance to do double damage. That's pretty basic, that's true for everybody. But for Assassination Rogue, it also gives us combo point gain. And the way it does that is that our Mutilate has 2 components, both of which can crit. And each one that does will give you an extra combo point. So Mutilate can either give you 2 combo points, 3 combo points if it crits on one of those, or 4 combo points if it crits on both. And the more combo points you get, the better. Fan of Knives also has a component of crit, which is that every time a Fan of Knives crits on any target, you get 1 extra combo point. So Fan of Knives gives you 1 combo point if you hit anything, and then it gives you 1 extra combo point for each crit that you get on anything, too. So once you're at a lot of targets, if you have enough crit, you're going to be making 5 combo points with every Fan of Knives, unless you're really unlucky, and that's pretty cool too. Crit actually has a little bit of tension with Haste. You don't really run into this yet at these levels of gear. You may eventually, depending on how high they scale in Battle for Azeroth, but crit, the more crit you have, the more combo points you're making, right? And Envenom, which is your finisher, costs less energy than Mutilate, which is your builder. But the more combo points your Mutilate generates, the more of your rotation is going to be finishers versus mutilates, right? Because you're only going to be doing 1 mutilate for every finisher instead of 2, for instance. And that means that your rotation is going to cost less energy, which means you're going to need haste less. That's not an effect that we see in the current patch, but it is an effect to look out for as we move into later patches that will cause a little bit of tension between crit and haste. As it stands right now, though, crit and haste are best friends because crit is increasing your damage in a lot of ways, and haste is also increasing your damage, and they multiply with each other, which is really nice. The next stat I want to talk about is Mastery. Mastery just increases the damage that your poisons and bleeds deal. So Rupture, Garrote, Deadly Poison, Wound Poison if you're running that, which you don't really in PvE, and Crimson Tempest. All of those just scale with Mastery. They scale at a pretty good rate with Mastery, so that ends up being good, but it doesn't give you any of those rotational benefits that Crit and Haste do in terms of removing your globals or increasing your ratio of finishers to builders, which is why Mastery is usually a little bit of a lower stat, particularly on single target, than Crit and Haste both are. And the last stat is Versatility. Versatility is a flat increase to all damage you deal, and a flat decrease to all damage you take. Obviously, like Mastery, it doesn't impact your rotation in the way that Haste and Crit do, so that's part of the reason that it's worse for us generally than those 2 stats. And it also scales worse than Mastery. But it does give you that damage reduction benefit, which is kind of hard to quantify. Usually if you're looking at stats, you're just looking at how much damage you deal, but you need to take into account that Versatility is the only stat of these that actually makes you more survivable, so that's worth considering too. Usually though, this is the stat that you least are interested in. Let's talk now about your single target stat priority, and this is the easiest one to figure out because you can just reliably simulate your own character. Simulations for single target are good. They're pretty much perfect actually. So you can go to a site like raidbots.com, you can import your character from the armory, or you can use an add-on to import all your gear and stuff as well, and then you can it'll tell you like, hey, this is how much each stat is worth for you. So for example, my character, at a certain point in time, the stat weights it gave me were main hand DPS. Each point of main hand DPS was worth 10.8 DPS, single target. Each point of haste was worth 2.5 DPS. Each point of mastery was worth 2.3. Each point of agility was worth 2.2. Each point of versatility was 2.1, and each point of crit was 2. These weights will fluctuate. There's a relationship between all the stats that is synergistic, so the more haste you have, the worse haste becomes relative to all your other stats, and that's true for all your stats. So if you have a ton of one stat, you're going to want to get a ton of the other stats instead of more of the stat you have a ton of. And that's going to be well reflected when you simulate your own character. You can check that out. The one point you'll get from this string is that, even though I was saying crit is good and versatility is bad, at the time I ran this sim, I had a lot of crit. So crit was actually my lowest scaling stat on single target. And that's going to be true for the stats are pretty close. They're fairly close. So if you get a ton of one stat, it's going to become worse than the others. That's a little bit less true for Haste right now because we're early in the expansion, so we're not at levels where Haste is starting to kind of bottom out, and it's such a good stat for us that you can keep getting Haste, and even if you're high Haste, more Haste will probably still be good for you. One thing I'd also like to point out from this string is just how good main hand DPS is. If you have a main hand dagger that is not your highest item level dagger, that's probably a mistake. You should probably just have your highest item level dagger there because main hand DPS scales so well. And then also, you can see that even though Haste is my best stat from this string, and Crit was my worst stat at the time, they're only apart by 0.5 DPS, right? So Haste is only 25% better than Crit. That means that you basically shouldn't be giving up more than a couple item levels to change around your stats when you have a string like this. Sometimes you'd see a string like 4 for one stat and 1 for another stat, and that would really tell you can drop a lot of item levels to get whatever stat has a 4 next to it and get away from whatever stat has a 1 next to it. But when you see a string like this, which is usually what you'll see as an Assassination Rogue, you should be moving towards just high item level across the board. So let's talk now about how our stats change in value when we add extra targets to a fight. And this is really the part where simulations fall behind and real-world experimentation, theory, those all kind of jump up in terms of figuring out how effective these stats are going to be. So the first situation I want to analyze is when there's a second target active in your boss fight, and it's active for some of the fight. Some percentage of the time there's a second target out, you can dot it. Interestingly here, even though Haste, as you add a lot of extra targets, starts becoming worse, when you add just that one target, Haste is still a great stat. In fact, it's even a little better than it is on single target because you still have these garbage globals that you're trying to get rid of, even with with bleeds ticking on 2 targets, and the increased bleed tick rate actually ends up being a huge portion of your damage on 2 targets. Your Garrotes and your Ruptures are just such a huge portion of your damage when you're fighting 2 targets because you're basically doing your single target rotation. So Mutilate stays the same, but Rupture and Garrote double in terms of how much they are of your damage, and that's why Haste is such a good stat in this situation. Mastery also obviously gets a little bit better because your bleeds and your poisons are such a high percentage of your damage in this instance too. And Versatility gets worse because it doesn't scale with anything, and Critical Strike stays about the same in this situation. The next situation I want to talk about is either a fortified dungeon or a boss fight with a lot of adds. One thing you'll notice off the bat is that Critical Strike just becomes insane in these situations. That's because Critical Strike is a good single target stat. For most rogues, it's actually not the worst stat like it was in the example string I showed you before, which was a little bit of an outlier for me. But it gets really, really good on multiple targets because when you're fighting these 5 to 7 numbers of targets, increasing your Critical Strike means your Fan of Knives is going to give you a lot more combo points for each of those extra points of crit you grab, and that's really, really good. That's a lot of that makes your rotation a lot better in those sorts of situations. Agility also gets a lot better here. Your damage is scaling really nicely with Agility as you add more of these targets, and it's scaling less well with your other stats, like Haste in these situations too. Haste gets a lot worse because your rotation no longer has these empty globals. You're getting all this extra energy regeneration from having all these extra bleeds active on a bunch of targets, so you end up actually losing that benefit of Haste. Haste is still doing things for you. It's still increasing your bleed tick rate and your poison tick rate, and that's good for your damage, but it's not doing the 2 good things anymore. It's just doing 1 good thing, so that's why it's a lot less valuable as a stat in this sort of situation. And Mastery does get a little bit better, particularly in a fortified dungeon when you're running Crimson Tempest, which obviously does scale with Mastery. That ends up being a stat that does jump up a little bit here, but I'd say that the main winner is Critical Strike, so that is a stat to really move towards, maybe move your gems and enchants away from Haste and towards Critical Strike for these sort of scenarios. And the last situation I want to talk about is Tyrannical Dungeons. Tyrannical Dungeons are interesting because most of the dungeon you're fighting trash, but the important parts of the dungeon where you really need to perform and do the most damage possible in order to actually beat the dungeon are the boss fights, right? You need to actually be able to kill those boss fights, so you need to make DPS checks, you need to kill them before your healer runs out of mana, you need to kill them before hard overlaps happen, and you need to kill them in a reasonable amount of time. So Critical Strike does get better because there are still a bunch of these AoE situations. Agility does also get better for those reasons. Mastery does get a little bit better too, but they get better by less than they do in Fortified weeks because you're still needing that high amount of haste to be able to perform in the single target situations, which are what Tyrannical Dungeons are often about. So in Tyrannical weeks, I move maybe half of my stats, half of my gems and enchants over to crit and away from haste, but I keep the others on haste to keep my single target as high as possible. Thanks for watching my guide to Assassination Rogue stats. I hope I've done a good job of explaining how the stats work. Invariably, I might have missed something, so if I have, please ask in the comments and I'll try my best to answer. And if you're confused about anything, look in the comments and I might have answered your question already. You can also check out my channel. Please subscribe there if you enjoyed this video. I've got other stuff there, much like this content, that you might enjoy. I have guides to affixes, I have guides to dungeons, I have other parts of this Assassination Rogue PvE guide, and soon I'll have other Rogue Spec guides. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.